Daniel Marsh was 21 years old when he found the eviction notice taped to his apartment door. An orange sheet of paper flapping in the wind that gave him 5 days to get out. He had no idea that in a few weeks, a $100 truck he was about to buy out of pure desperation would end up hiding something that would change his entire life. But first, things had to get a lot worse before they got better. He'd lost his job at the warehouse 3 weeks earlier. Cutbacks, they called it. Nothing personal. But rent doesn't care about cutbacks, and neither does a landlord who's already found a new tenant willing to pay more. 5 days later, Daniel stood on the sidewalk with 2 duffel bags and a backpack, watching a stranger carry a couch into the apartment that used to be his. He had $400 in a torn envelope, and that was everything he had left in the world. For the first few nights, he slept wherever he could. A 24-hour laundromat with fluorescent lights that never turned off, and the constant hum of dryers running through the night. A corner of the public library, where he'd pretend to read until closing, forced him back onto the street, watching the staff lock the doors behind him like they were sealing off the only warm place he had left. One night, out of options, he curled up behind a dumpster and woke up to a raccoon rifling through a bag 6 inches from his face. He applied for jobs every single day, walking into diners and hardware stores in the one clean shirt he kept folded at the bottom of his duffel bag so it wouldn't wrinkle. At a hardware store on the edge of downtown, a manager named Pete actually sat him down and looked over his application for a long moment before asking, gently, for an address and a callback number. Daniel gave him the library's number and said he'd check in himself. Pete just nodded slowly, the kind of nod that told Daniel everything he needed to know before the rejection call ever came. Without an address, without a phone that still had service most days, without even a place to shower before an interview, the rejections piled up fast. Some managers were kind about it, the way Pete had been. Others barely looked up from the counter. He started rationing food without meaning to, splitting a gas station sandwich across 2 meals, lingering at fast food counters just long enough to charge his phone before someone asked him to buy something or leave. He learned which grocery stores threw out day-old bread around closing time, and which ones locked their dumpsters. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from never really sleeping, from part of his brain always staying alert for footsteps, for someone telling him to move along. He hadn't realized how much energy that constant vigilance was eating until it was the only thing he had left to give. Winter was coming, and Daniel could feel it in the mornings. That bite in the air telling him the laundromat and the library weren't going to be enough for much longer. He needed 4 walls and a roof, even a bad one, especially a bad one, because a bad one was all he could afford. That's when he saw the flyer pinned to a corkboard outside a gas station, a handwritten index card that read, "Truck for sale, runs rough, as is, $100, cash only." Daniel had counted his money that morning. After food for the week, he had exactly $112 to his name. He called the number from a payphone outside a diner, one of the last working payphones left in the county. An old farmer named Walt answered, gruff but not unkind, and gave him directions to a property 4 miles out of town. Daniel walked the whole way in worn-out sneakers, his backpack digging into his shoulders, past fields and fence lines and one dog that barked itself hoarse from behind a chain-link gate. And by the time he reached the farm, the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. The truck was sitting in tall grass beside a rusted equipment shed, and it looked exactly as bad as he'd feared. A faded red Ford pickup with rust eating through the wheel wells, a crack running the length of the windshield, bald tires, and a side mirror held on with duct tape. Walt walked him around it with brutal honesty. The heater didn't work. The check engine light had been on so long he'd taped a piece of paper over it. It burned oil, and the bed had a dent Walt couldn't explain, even though he'd owned the thing for years. But the engine turned over, the tires held air, and Daniel didn't need it to win any races. He needed it to have 4 walls and a lock on the door. He handed over the $100 in crumpled bills, and Walt tossed him the keys without much ceremony. Just like that, Daniel Marsh owned a truck. His first real possession in weeks. His new address, if you could call it that. That first night, he parked between 2 dumpsters behind a closed-down hardware store and climbed into a cab that smelled like motor oil and mildew, like the truck had sat through one too many rainy seasons with a leak somewhere in the roof. The vinyl seats were cracked and cold under him, but it was his. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Daniel Marsh slept somewhere with a door he could lock. The weeks that followed were brutal in ways he hadn't prepared for. Without a working heater, the cold seeped into the cab every night, so he layered cardboard over the windows for insulation, taping flattened boxes he pulled from behind grocery stores. He found a sleeping bag in a donation bin outside a church, one with a broken zipper he had to hold shut with a safety pin. He showered on a stretched-out free trial pass at a gym and filled out job applications on library Wi-Fi, nursing a single cup of coffee for 3 hours at a time so nobody would ask him to leave. One night, close to 3 in the morning, a sharp knock on the window jolted him awake. A police officer stood outside with a flashlight, and Daniel's heart pounded as he braced for a ticket, or worse, an order to move along with nowhere else to go. Instead, the officer just nodded, told him he could stay until sunrise, and mentioned a shelter 2 towns over that might have an opening. Then he walked back to his cruiser and drove off into the dark. Small mercies. Daniel was starting to learn how much those mattered when you had nothing else. But not every night was gentle. One night, the temperature dropped low enough that he woke up shaking, breath fogging inside the cab, and had to run the rough idling engine for 20 minutes just to feel his fingers again, terrified the noise would draw attention or drain the last of his gas money. Another night, rain hammered the metal roof so hard he couldn't sleep at all, just lay there tracing the crack in the windshield with his eyes over and over until the sun came up gray and exhausted. He kept a notebook he'd found in the glove box, and some nights, when sleep wouldn't come, he'd write down how many days it had been. Day 9, Day 16, Day 23. Not for anyone else to read, just so some part of him could keep track of how long he'd survived, something he genuinely wasn't sure he'd survive. Food was the hardest part to manage. He picked up 2 days a week at a temp agency doing warehouse loading, just enough to cover gas and the cheapest food he could find, but never enough to save toward an actual apartment. Every time he got close to a cushion, the truck needed something. A new belt. A jump start after the battery died in the cold. Some weeks it felt like the ground kept shifting under him, no matter how carefully he tried to stand still. About 3 weeks into living in the truck, on a Sunday afternoon with nothing else to do, Daniel finally decided to clean it out properly. He'd been living in it, but he'd never really gone through it. Walt had cleared out most of his own belongings before selling it, but there were still crumpled fast food bags, old receipts, and a thick layer of dust coating every surface. He started with the glove box, expecting nothing more than an owner's manual and some expired napkins. Instead, his fingers hit something solid, wedged all the way at the back, behind a stack of yellowed paperwork. He pulled out an old leather wallet, cracked with age, the stitching coming apart at the seams. His hands went still for a second. This didn't feel like something Walt had simply forgotten. It felt like something that had been hidden. Inside was an expired driver's license belonging to a man named Harold Bennett. The photo faded almost to nothing, and a small, folded black and white photograph of a young couple standing in front of what looked like this exact same truck, back when the paint was still bright red and the chrome still gleamed. Daniel sat there for a long moment, staring at it. Whoever Harold Bennett was, this truck had clearly meant something to him once. He kept searching. Under the bench seat, wedged into a gap where the springs had worn through the fabric, his fingers found something heavier, and it took both hands to work it loose. A small metal box, dented on one corner like it had been dropped more than once. No lock on the simple latch. His pulse picked up as he opened it. Inside were old coins you don't see in circulation anymore. A plain gold ring worn smooth from decades of wear, and folded into a tight square underneath all of it. A letter, the paper gone soft and yellow with age. Daniel unfolded it as carefully as he could, worried it might tear apart in his hands. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned cursive, clearly written by someone who'd learned to write in a very different era. It was a love letter dated more than 50 years earlier, from a woman named Eleanor to the man she called her dearest Harold, about missing him while he was away, about a ring she hoped he'd keep safe until he came home to put it on her finger properly. Sitting in the cab of $100 truck, cold air leaking through the cracked windshield, Daniel read a love letter meant for people who might not even be alive anymore. And something about it hit him harder than he expected. Whoever these people were, whatever had happened to them, somebody out there might still want to know where this ring ended up. He didn't have a home, a job, or a plan for next month. But for the first time in weeks, he had something that felt like a purpose, beyond just surviving the day. The next morning, Daniel went to the public library and started digging. He searched Harold Bennett alongside the town where he'd bought the truck, scrolling through digitized newspaper archives for hours before a name jumped out at him. An obituary from nearly 15 years earlier for a Harold Bennett who'd lived just outside the county his whole life, survived by a daughter and 2 grandchildren. The dates lined up. The town lined up. He tried a few leads first, and every one of them hit a wall. A phone number listed in an old classified ad that turned out to belong to a confused stranger with no idea what Daniel was talking about. A church directory from decades earlier that listed a Bennett family in the congregation, but when Daniel called the office, the secretary told him the family had moved out of state years back, and she had no forwarding information. A county records clerk, who was kind enough to check, but came back empty-handed, telling him property records that old just weren't digitized yet. He almost gave up more than once. It would have been easy to. Nobody was making him do any of this. And some nights, sitting in the cold cab with the metal box on his lap, he wondered if he was chasing a mystery that didn't actually matter to anyone but him. But then he'd unfold the letter again, read Eleanor's careful handwriting, and something about her words, written to a man she clearly loved with everything she had, kept pulling him back to the search. Daniel found a local genealogy group on social media, the kind of small community page where people traded old photographs and family history and helped each other track down long-lost relatives. He posted a photo of the letter, the ring, and the black and white picture, explaining that he'd found them inside an old truck and was trying to return them to whoever might still be family. He expected silence, maybe a few curious comments and nothing more. Instead, within 2 days, a woman named Carol Bennett Hughes commented on the post. She said the ring in the photo looked exactly like the one her grandmother Eleanor used to describe, the one her grandfather Harold had supposedly lost decades ago and never stopped talking about. Carol messaged Daniel directly, and they arranged to meet at a small diner in town, the same kind of diner where he'd once used a payphone to call about a $100 truck. When Daniel handed Carol the metal box, her hands were shaking before she'd even opened it. She recognized the ring immediately, said her grandmother had worn one just like it in every old photo the family had, right up until the day it mysteriously disappeared, sometime around when Harold's old truck was sold off to cover medical bills. Eleanor passed away herself just 2 years after Harold, and the family had always assumed the ring was lost for good. Carol read the letter at that table, tears running down her face, and told Daniel that her grandparents had been married for over 40 years before Harold passed, but that this letter was from before that, from back when Harold had been away working out of state and Eleanor had been waiting for him to come home. She looked up at Daniel and asked him, quietly, how she could possibly repay him for something like this. Daniel told her honestly that he hadn't done it for a reward. He just felt like the ring belonged with someone who would understand what it meant. But Carol wasn't about to let it end there. She insisted, And over the following weeks, her family came together and offered him something Daniel never could have imagined asking for. They wanted to help him get back on his feet. Not out of pity, Carol made that clear, but out of genuine gratitude for what he'd done, for taking the time to search when he could have just kept the ring and the coins and moved on with his life, and nobody would have known the difference. The family helped cover a security deposit on a small apartment, the first real bed Daniel had slept in since the eviction notice went up on his door. He remembers standing in that empty apartment on the first night, nothing in it but a mattress on the floor and a single lamp, and feeling something close to disbelief that he had 4 solid walls again that nobody could tell him to leave. They connected him with a family friend who ran a landscaping business and needed extra hands, someone who was willing to actually show up and work hard, which Daniel absolutely was. He threw himself into that job the way you throw yourself into something when you know exactly what it feels like to have nothing. He was the first one on site most mornings and the last one to leave, and within a year the owner had made him a crew lead. Slowly, month by month, Daniel Marsh started rebuilding the life that had collapsed underneath him just months earlier. He opened a savings account for the first time in his adult life. He started paying off the small debts that had piled up during the worst of it. He stayed in touch with Carol and her family, and every year around the holidays, he'd stop by with a small gift. Nothing extravagant, just a way of saying he hadn't forgotten what they'd done for him. He kept the truck, even after he could afford something more reliable. Even after friends joked that he should scrap it for parts, he couldn't bring himself to get rid of it. He fixed the heater himself, learning the basics from online tutorials and a second-hand Ford repair manual. He patched the rust, replaced the cracked windshield, and eventually got the check engine light sorted out too. A few years after that first landscaping job, Daniel took the leap and started his own crew. Just 2 guys and a trailer full of borrowed equipment at first. He undercut nobody and over-delivered on everyone, the same way he'd worked every job since the day Pete had turned him down, without ever saying a cruel word about it. Slowly, the client list grew. Word got around town the way it does in smaller places, one satisfied homeowner telling another, until the 2 guys became 6, and the borrowed equipment became owned equipment. Today, that same $100 truck sits parked outside the small landscaping company Daniel eventually built up, over several years of showing up early and working later than anyone else on the crew. It's not fancy. The paint job is still a little uneven, where he touched it up himself. But it runs, and it's his, and it carries a story most people would never guess just by looking at it. Daniel still keeps a framed copy of that black and white photograph in his office, the one of the young couple standing in front of the exact same truck decades earlier. He says it reminds him that you never really know what you're carrying, and you never really know what a single decision, even one made out of pure desperation, might end up leading to. He was 21 years old, with $400 and nowhere to sleep, when he bought a rusted truck for $100, just to have somewhere with a locking door. He had no idea that truck was about to hand him back the one thing he needed most. Not money, not luck, but a reason to keep going. If this story moved you, there are more out there just like it. Stories about people who had almost nothing and found their way back through the smallest, strangest twist of fate. Stick around, because the next one might surprise you even more.